The big gap between the private sector and public sector is what you get for retirement benefits, and that would be both for the health benefits you receive when retired and also what you receive in terms of a pension. You're much more likely to be covered by a traditional pension in state and local employment. You're also more likely to have access to retiree health benefits than workers do in the private sector. That's a big gap in favor of these workers. On the other hand, the money wages received by public employees tend to be less than the private employees receive for the same level of skill. Whether the benefits of getting better retirement benefits offset the cost of working for lower weekly cash salaries, I don't know. Obviously, different people feel differently. The critical thing, though, for most public employees is they accepted the lower salaries in the expectation that they would get better retirement protection. And if the government then reneges on the pension and the retiree health benefits, they would have made sacrifices in terms of receiving lower pay throughout their career, and they would not have gotten the prize that they thought public employment was going to give them. Historically, union movement first arose in the private sector, and it really exploded in the 1930s through the 1950s in the private sector. More private employees were members of unions by the end of the 50s and the beginning of the 60s than was the case in the public sector. One reason, of course, was that public sector workers had less grievance against their employer than a lot of private sector workers did. Many public employees around the country were already covered by a lot of civil service protection, and also they got good basic wages compared with the lowest wages paid in the private sector, so they had less reason to join unions. Over the course of the 1970s and 80s, the positions of the public sector and private sector completely reversed, so public sector unionization continued to rise. It reached a plateau, I think, sometime in the 1980s. A little bit more than 1 out of 3 public employees in the United States is covered by a union contract versus about 7% in the case of private sector workers. Well, there's one area where we do have recurring strikes in the United States, and that is frequently in the fall when the school year begins. We see sprinkled around the country teacher strikes, job actions to keep schools closed while the teachers negotiate for a better deal. Certainly that kind of strike will be less common if the governors and legislatures of states weaken the ability of unions to get members, for example, by saying that no one has to contribute to the union in the form of union dues if they choose not to. For example, by saying that the state has no obligation to negotiate with unions on any term of employment except the money wage. Those kinds of things would greatly weaken the unions in their efforts to organize a lot of workers in a state, or even retain the loyalty of the union members they already have. If they can't negotiate over the full range of conditions of employment as they historically have been able to do, then there's less reason for anybody to join a union and to pay dues to the union. I think Republicans have traditionally opposed unions and opposed a lot of parts of labor law that protect the right to organize workers. Personally, my view is that in the private sector, employers have become so successful at defeating union organization efforts that it is a passé issue in much of the private sector. The number speaks for itself. Only 7% of the wage and salary workers in the private sector of the United States are members of labor unions or covered by collective bargaining agreements. That must be amongst the lowest of any rich democracy in the world. That is the lowest private sector unionization rate, I think, in the industrialized world. In the public sector, after a long period in which they grew and became more influential, public employee unions have sort of plateaued. They're not getting any stronger. They're not getting appreciably weaker up until this year, but they're not growing any longer. They stopped growing some time ago. And certainly if a few states where traditional unions were powerful see the public employee unions suffering a crushing defeat, which would certainly be the case here in Wisconsin, I think you're going to see more conservative lawmakers, conservative governors try to achieve a breakthrough in which they reduce the power of the unions to negotiate over terms of employment.